This is the Ministry of Truth. I'm Gordon Comstock, and this is part 2 of Woe Unto You, Lawyers by Fred Rodell from 1939, out of print, for a reason. Chapter 3, The Way It Works. Quote, "The lawless science of our law, that codeless myriad of precedent, that wilderness of single instances," unquote, Alfred Lord Tennyson. In order to demonstrate up to the hilt that the whole of the law is a hoax, a balloon, a lot of empty words, it would presumably be necessary to take each principle and sub-principle and counter-principle of the law in turn and divest each one of its dazzling legal trappings, so that the non-lawyer could see that there was nothing inside of them. Plainly, that would be impossible. The lawyer judges alone turn out each year hundreds upon hundreds of books full of nothing but refinements of the law and its principles. Tremendous libraries overflow with volumes which are not even about the law, but which are part of the law. Parentheses. Lawyers, incidentally, spend most of their working lives trying to make a small dent in the mountains of literature that help make up the law. End parenthesis. Yet it may perhaps serve the general deflating or disrobing purpose to take the legal pants, step by easy step, off a few simple and entirely typical examples of the law in action. The field of the law, known as contracts, is one of the most settled, most venerable, and least politically complicated fields of the law. It is the field of law that deals with the agreements, business or otherwise, that men or companies, parentheses, but companies, remember, are nothing but men to the law, end parentheses, make with each other. Those agreements usually consist of one man promising to do one thing, such as to dig a ditch, and another man promising to do another thing, such as to hand over $50. Of course, if men could be trusted to keep their promises, there would be no excuse for a law of contracts. But then if men could be trusted to act decently in general, there would be little need for law of any kind. As a matter of fact, only gamblers trust each other to keep their promises, for the law will not stoop to enforce a gambling agreement or bet. How's that for an irony? The whole law of contracts is based on the idea that men in general cannot be trusted to keep their promises, and around this area of mutual mistrust, the law lays down its principles. The first principle is that before you can have a contract that the law will uphold, you must have an offer by one party and an acceptance by another party. Parenthesis. Only the law insists on making a quote-unquote party out of a single person. End parenthesis. What then, in the first place, is a legal offer? It is something quite different from an ordinary non-legal offer, in the sense that the man in the street might use that word. A lawyer would scoff at the notion that most offers were offers. with a capital O. For instance, if a man says to his gardener, "Tony, I'll give you $50. That is not a legal offer. If a man says to his gardener, "Tony, I'll give you $50 if you'll dig a ditch for me," that is not an offer either. But if a man says to his gardener, "Tony, if you'll dig a ditch for me, 2 feet deep and 3 feet wide, running from the northwest corner of the house to the pig pen, and finish it by Wednesday week," though the law would frown on such colloquial phrasing, "I'll pay you $50 when you get it done." Now that is an offer with a capital O. And incidentally, if Tony says, "Okay, boss," then that's a full-fledged acceptance with a capital A. What is it that makes the third proposition a legal offer, whereas the first two were not? Briefly, it is the fact that it is definite enough so that when Tony says, "Okay, boss," the boss knows that Tony knows, and most important, any judge would know exactly what Tony was expected to do. Of course, the whole question of whether something is an offer or isn't an offer is based on the assumption that Tony and his boss may someday end up in court over their conversation. And on that basis, it seems fair enough to say that if Tony promised to do something definite, he made a contract, parentheses, which means only that a court will hold him to his promise or soak him for breaking it, end parentheses. And if he did not promise to do something definite, he did not make a contract. But the phony part is the way the law brings into the picture one of its irrelevant generalities. Here, the abstract idea of a legal offer. In talking about and dealing with a simple business arrangement. If Tony and his boss should ever get into court over the undug ditch, the law of the case would be solemnly stated like this: the proposition was definite. Therefore, it was a valid offer. Therefore, once it was accepted, there was a valid contract. Therefore, Tony must dig or pay, or else the proposition was too indefinite. Therefore, there was no valid offer. Therefore, there was no contract. Therefore, Tony need do nothing. The point is that the question of there being or not being an offer is utter nonsense. The whole business could be reduced very simply to: the proposition was definite, therefore Tony must dig or pay, or the proposition was indefinite, therefore Tony need do nothing. But of course, to simplify legal reasoning, even to this small extent, would make the case immediately more comprehensible, much more, to the non-lawyer, and would leave the lawyers with no special and mystifying lingo in which to discuss a simple little problem. Moreover, it would leave the law out of the picture. The law, remember, is that before you have a contract, you have to have not an offer, not even a definite offer, but a legal offer with a capital O. To get back to the ditch, suppose Tony, instead of saying, "Okay, boss," had said, "I dig him for $60, boss." And the boss had then said, "Okay, Tony." The average man would say that they had come to terms. And if the law enforces that kind of thing, that's fine. The law would enforce it, all right, but not in those words. To the law, Tony's comment would first have to be a counter-offer, involving an implied rejection of the original offer, and the boss's okay would then become an acceptance of the counter offer. And if, by any chance, the boss had come back at Tony with, "How about 55?" that would have been a counter offer involving an implied etc. It takes 3 years to get through law school. The acceptance of an offer is not always so simple as an okay boss or an okay Tony either. For instance, the boss might have described the ditch he wanted and how much he would pay for it, and Tony might have said nothing, and then the boss might have set out for the 8:20 train, leaving his offer, as it were, hanging in midair. 3 days later, he comes back and finds the ditch all dug. Did he have to pay the $50 he offered for it? Any moron would say, of course he does. But why, according to the law? Apparently, there was no acceptance, with a capital A. And you can't have a valid contract, capital C, without an acceptance, with a capital A. And maybe by this time the boss has decided he doesn't want the ditch anyway, or that $50 is too much to pay for it. The law slides out of this one neatly and easily. The digging of the ditch, says the law, amounts to an acceptance. Now, the digging of the ditch amounted to performance too, with a capital P, another and more or less obvious legal concept, but that does not stop it from being an acceptance at the same time. And if the law could not find an acceptance somewhere, there would be no valid contract, and Tony might never get his $50, which would be obviously silly, just about as silly as looking all around for an acceptable acceptance before you see to it that he does get paid. Suppose, though, that when the boss gets home, Tony has dug not the whole ditch, but half of it. And the boss then says, "I don't want the ditch, and I won't pay for it, so don't finish it." And Tony says, "But boss, you promise," and proceeds to finish the ditch and sue for his $50. The court will then settle down to deciding, under the law, not whether it was fair for the boss to take back his promise after the ditch was half dug, but whether digging half the ditch did or did not amount to an acceptance of the offer. For before Tony gets paid, the court must find a valid contract, and before it finds a valid contract, it must find an acceptance. Probably Tony would get his $50 if he had dug half the ditch by the time his boss backed down. But if Tony had only shoveled a few spadefuls of earth by the time his boss got home and said the ditch wasn't wanted, those few spadefuls would never amount to enough acceptance to satisfy the court. Thus it becomes apparent that somewhere along the ditch's projected course, somewhere between the start and the finish of the job, the law, stooping to earth, first finds a magic line. Then, if the boss catches Tony 1 inch on one side of the line, the law will intone no acceptance, no contract, no $50. Whereas if Tony is 1 inch on the other side of the line, the law will intone acceptance, contract, pay up. But neither the law nor any lawyer can ever tell you in advance where that magic line is. A lawyer can only tell you what the law is. The law, you may remember, is that you have to have an acceptance of an offer before you have a contract. Another great abstract concept in the law of contracts is something called consideration. There has to be consideration as well as offer and acceptance, and a number of other solemn spoken legalisms before a contract is good in the eyes of the law. Putting it very roughly, consideration generally means that a contract has to be two-sided. Each quote-unquote party to it has to have something given him or promised him or done for him in return for what he gives or promises or does. In l'affaire Tony and Boss, the consideration for Tony's promise to dig a ditch was his boss's promise to pay Tony $50. And the consideration for the boss's promise was, in turn, Tony's promise, or if Tony didn't promise, the actual digging of the ditch became the consideration. Parentheses. Thus, a common or garden digging of a ditch can be dignified by the law into an acceptance, a consideration, and a performance all at the same time. End parenthesis. Theoretically, the purpose of insisting on consideration is to see to it that a contract is a fair bargain. Actually, however, the law, time after time, finds consideration in an extremely unfair bargain, and fails to find consideration where the proposition looks relatively fair. If a man says to a panhandler, quote, "I like your face, so tomorrow I'm going to give you $1, unquote, there is no consideration for the promise, and so there is no contract, since the law does not take such aesthetic values into account. But if a man says to a panhandler, quote, "If you'll give me that cigarette in your hand, I'll give you $100 tomorrow," unquote, and then the bum hands over the cigarette, then there is consideration for the promise, and there may well be a valid contract. And if there were enough witnesses to the transaction who will swear to it in court, the panhandler may even get his $100. For the law of contracts rarely pays attention to surrounding circumstances. So far as the law is concerned, a man offered to pay $100 for a cigarette and got the cigarette. For all the law knows, the two men may have been lost in the middle of the desert, and the cigarette their last smoke, or the cigarette may have belonged to Franklin Roosevelt, or may have been autographed by Babe Ruth. At any rate, someone offered $100 for it and got it, and a cigarette, or a match for that matter, can be plenty good consideration, even for a promise to pay $100. Now, a good half of the voluminous law of contracts is concerned with what is good consideration and what is not good consideration. As a matter of fact, once offers and acceptances and a few other little things are out of the way, the whole question of whether a court will or will not uphold a promise comes down to a question of whether there was or wasn't good consideration for it. At least, that is the legal way of putting it. But a non-lawyer, untrained in legal logic, and trying to find a definition of consideration that made sense to him, might well put the whole business completely in reverse. He might say that, so far as he can see, consideration is what there is when a court upholds a promise, and what there isn't when a court refuses to uphold a promise. In other words, the whole question of whether a court is going to say there is consideration or not comes down to a question of whether the court is going to uphold a promise or not. And though to a lawyer such a notion would amount to blasphemy, there is no doubt at all that from a practical standpoint, the apparently naive non-lawyer is exactly right. For example, suppose a chorus girl has two wealthy admirers. One of them promises her a fur coat for Christmas. The other promises a diamond bracelet. On Christmas Day, the fur coat arrives, but the bracelet doesn't. Can the chorus girl, do you suppose, go into court and sue for the bracelet and get it, on the theory that the first admirer's promise of a fur coat was good consideration for the second admirer's promise of a bracelet? Briefly, she cannot. And the whole idea of taking two promises made by separate people to a third person and calling one of them consideration for the other sounds, of course, utterly fantastic. Yet, suppose the two admirers frequented not only the same girl, but the same church. And suppose the church was putting on a subscription drive for funds, and each man agreed to contribute $1,000. And the man who promised the bracelet paid up, but the man who gave the fur coat did not, presumably because he could no longer afford to. Could the church go into court and sue for the $1,000 and collect it? Briefly, it could. It could, moreover, on the theory that each of the promises to pay $1,000 was good consideration for the other one. A cynic might explain all this on the ground that the law approves of gifts to churches and does not approve of gifts to chorus girls. The cynic would not be far wrong. Certainly, the strange doctrine whereby mutual promises to give money to worthy causes are considered good legal consideration for each other developed out of nothing more complicated than a desire on the part of the courts to keep people from welching on such promises. The law, in order to uphold such promises, had to find considerations somewhere and found it. Or, as the naive layman would put it, consideration was what there was when the courts wanted to uphold a promise, and what there wasn't and isn't when the courts just plain don't care. Perhaps the strangest of the many things that the law lumps together as amounting to consideration for a contract is a seal on a piece of paper. A man can write down, "I, John Doe, promise to pay Richard Rogue $500 on the 1st of January. And he can sign it and give the paper to Rogue and still never pay a cent, provided Rogue cannot prove that Doe got something, some consideration, in return for the promise. But if Doe drops a blob of sealing wax next to his signature and makes a mark in it, or if he just draws a circular squiggle by his name and puts in it the initials LS, which are the abbreviations for Latin and therefore legal, words for seal, then Doe will have to pay. He will have to pay even though he got absolutely nothing in return for his promise. He will have to pay because the law long ago decided that a seal, real or imitation, attached to a promise, amounted to good consideration for that promise, despite the fact that the man who makes the promise puts the seal there. This, of course, is a long way from the original idea of consideration as something given to, or promised to, or done for the man who makes the promise. The law's excuse may be to the effect that no man would be fool enough to seal a promise unless he were going to get something out of it for himself. Yet it happens that seals were first used on contracts as X's might be used today, as substitutes for the signatures of those who could not sign their names. And so the law, in honoring the seeming solemnity of a seal, is in effect making a stupid substitute for a signature worth more than the signature itself. It is also saying, as our naive layman would put it, the law wants to uphold promises with seals attached. Since the law cannot find any other consideration for such promises, it will just treat the seals themselves as consideration and let things go at that. Without piling up examples any further, it is then apparent that consideration can mean the digging of half a ditch, it can mean a cigarette, it can mean a promise by a total stranger to give money to a church, or it can mean a piece of sealing wax on a sheet of paper. Yet it also is apparent that none of these things has the slightest conceivable relation to any of the others. And the list of unrelated things that lawyers may label consideration, or that judges have labeled consideration, runs literally into the millions. The point is that the so-called concept of consideration is both meaningless and useless unless you know every one of the countless fact situations about which courts have said, here there is consideration, or here there is no consideration. But once you know all those fact situations, what has consideration become? It has become an enormous and shapeless grab bag, so full of unrelated particulars that it is just as meaningless and just as useless as it was before. That same mass of particulars might just as well be lumped together and called infatuation, or Omsk Club, or bingo. Any of these words would be just as helpful as the word consideration in trying to solve, or guessing how the courts will solve, any new problem that comes up, which is, after all, the sole legitimate function of the law. The new problem itself will involve a set of facts. That set of facts will look something like other sets of facts about which the courts have intoned consideration. It will also inevitably look something like other sets of facts about which the courts have intoned no consideration. Until a court intones consideration or no consideration about the new problem, no lawyer in the world can know whether this new set of facts belongs inside or outside the consideration grab bag. What is true of the word consideration is, moreover, equally true of the words offer and acceptance, and of every so-called concept in the law of contracts. It is equally true of every so-called concept of the law, period. For no legal concept means anything, or can mean anything, even to a lawyer, until its supposed content of meaning has been detailed in terms of its precise practical application right down to the case that was decided yesterday. And once the concept has been so detailed, it is the details, not the concept, that matter. The concept, no more than a word, or set of words, in the strange vocabulary of the law, the concept might just as well be tossed out the window. Thus the layman, who would have defined consideration as what there is when a court upholds a promise, and what there isn't when it refuses to uphold a promise, is absolutely right. Consideration, and every other so-called concept or principle of the law, amounts to a vague legal way of stating a result applied to the result after the result is reached, instead of being, as the lawyers and judges stoutly pretend, a reason for reaching the result in the first place. By the use of these concepts, the lawyers bewilder the non-legal world, and, too often, themselves, into supposing the law and its rulings are scientific, logical, foreordained. Yet no concept, or combination of concepts, or rule built out of concepts, as all legal rules are built, can of itself provide an automatic solution to the simplest conceivable human problem. Like the symbols on a doctor's prescription, it can provide no more than an impressive after-the-decision description of what the judge's order. And what the judge's order is the law. Now, a super-intelligent and super-outspoken lawyer or judge may occasionally admit that his legal brethren are either fools or liars when they claim that the words and concepts and principles of the law are any more than statements of results in legal language. But this same rare member of the profession will probably go on to defend the vast vocabulary of the law, the considerations and malices and domiciles and all the rest, on the theory that it provides at least a sort of legal shorthand, a convenient medium in which lawyers can talk to each other about their trade. When one lawyer, discussing a case at a cocktail party, as lawyers always do, shoots interstate commerce or privileged communication at a fellow member of the bar, with that well-known air of studied nonchalance which children affect when talking pig Latin before their elders, the second lawyer has a general idea what the first is talking about. So, too, does a judge get a general idea of which way the argument is drifting when a lawyer tosses off a legal phrase in court. And when the judge in turn packs his opinions with such phrases, the lawyers who read those opinions get, if nothing more, a vague sense of treading familiar ground. Shorthand, if you will, though it is a shorthand which all too easily becomes unbearably long-winded, as anyone who has ever tried to read a lease or a statute or a judicial opinion well knows. Yet It is precisely out of the constant and careless use of a loose craft lingo that the lawyer's blind faith in the sacredness of words has grown. Meticulously trained in the legal mumbo-jumbo of legal concepts, subjected to it every minute of their working lives, the law boys passionately believe in the words they have learned to use. To them, due process of law is not just a handy way of referring to a bunch of old decisions. It is a fighting principle. And even such legal lovelies as a covenant running with the land, or an estate in fee tail, take on substance and dignity. Nor is it only the plain, ordinary lawyers who take their funny words and their word-made abstractions seriously. Most judges are more likely than not to suppose, when they order a payment made, quote-unquote, because there was consideration for a contract, that they have actually reasoned from the abstract to the concrete, that the unearthly concept called consideration has actually dictated their judgment, as though the abstraction, consideration, had substance, meat, body. As though it were possible for the human mind to pull a specific result out of an abstract concept, like a rabbit out of a hat, without first, knowingly or unknowingly, putting the result into the concept so it can later be found there. A court will solemnly purport to decide whether Tony is going to be paid for digging a ditch on the basis of whether there was consideration to support a contract, just as though the idea of consideration contained within itself, like a command from God, the right answer, or any answer. A court will solemnly purport to decide that the state of New Jersey may not regulate ticket scalpers, for the reason that the sale of theater tickets is a business not affected with a public interest. A court will solemnly purport to decide that the federal government may not supervise wages in the coal industry, on the ground that those wages have only an indirect effect on interstate commerce, parentheses. And then the same court will solemnly purport to decide that the federal government may force a steel company to deal with a union on the ground that steel wages have a direct effect on interstate commerce, end parentheses. As though, in each case, the legal phrase used were anything more than a circumloquacious statement of the result, rather than a reason for arriving at it. As though, in any case, any abstract legal phrase could conceivably contain the right key, or any key, to the solution of a concrete social or political or human problem. Dealing in words is a dangerous business, and it cannot be too often stressed that what the law deals in is words. Dealing in long, vague, fuzzy-meaning words is even more dangerous business, and most of the words the law deals in are long and vague and fuzzy. Making a habit of applying long, vague, fuzzy, general words to specific things and facts is perhaps the most dangerous of all, and the law does that too. You can call a cow a quadruped mammal if you want to. You can also call a cat a quadruped mammal. But if you get into the habit of calling both cows and cats quadruped mammals, it becomes all too easy to slip into a line of reasoning whereby, since cats are quadruped mammals, and cats have kittens, and cows are also quadruped mammals, therefore cows have kittens too. The law, you may remember, calls both cigarettes and sealing wax consideration. Principle and sub-principle and counter-principle of the law in turn, and divest each one of its dazzling legal trappings, so that the non-lawyer could see that there was nothing inside of them. Plainly, that would be impossible. The lawyer judges alone turn out each year hundreds upon hundreds of books full of nothing but refinements of the law and its principles. Tremendous libraries overflow with volumes which are not even about the law, but which are part of the law. Parentheses. Lawyers, incidentally, spend most of their working lives trying to make a small dent in the mountains of literature that help make up the law. End parentheses. Yet it may perhaps serve the general deflating or disrobing purpose to take the legal pants, step by easy step, off a few simple and entirely typical examples of the law in action. The field of the law, known as contracts, is one of the most settled, most venerable, and least politically complicated fields of the law. It is the field of law that deals with the agreements, business or otherwise, that men or companies, parentheses, but companies, remember, are nothing but men to the law. The whole law of contracts is based on the idea that men in general cannot be trusted to keep their promises, and around this area of mutual mistrust, the law lays down its principles. The first principle is that before you can have a contract that the law will uphold, you must have an offer by one party and an acceptance by another party. Parenthesis. Only the law insists on making a quote-unquote party out of a single person. End parenthesis. What then, in the first place, is a legal offer? It is something quite different from an ordinary non-legal offer in the sense, end parentheses, make with each other. Those agreements usually consist of one man promising to do one thing, such as to dig a ditch, and another man promising to do another thing, such as to hand over $50. Of course, if men could be trusted to keep their promises, there would be no excuse for a law of contracts. But then if men could be trusted to act decently in general, there would be little need for law of any kind. As a matter of fact, only gamblers trust each other to keep their promises, for the law will not stoop to enforce a gambling agreement or bet. How's that for an irony? This is the Ministry of Truth. I'm Gordon Comstock, and this is part 2 of Woe Unto You, Lawyers, by Fred Rodell from 1939, out of print, for a reason. Chapter 3, The Way It Works. Quote, the lawless science of our law, that codeless myriad of precedent, that wilderness of single instances, unquote, Alfred Lord Tennyson. In order to demonstrate up to the hilt that the whole of the law is a hoax, a balloon, a lot of empty words, it would presumably be necessary to take each